Okay, let's continue with part 2 of the book, which is about urban resilience, and now we're going to talk about what do we know. This chapter 3, so the chapter numbers are continued through the parts. We just have different questions being the focus. The impacts of climate and environmental change on cities. They are disproportionate emitters, and they also are high density centers with unique vulnerabilities. The future is always uncertain, yet it seems clear that cities will grow and that climate will change, although disparately. So climate change doesn't affect everybody the same way. This is from Natural Hazards and Unnatural Disasters, the Economics of Effective Prevention, another older World Bank report. The quote: main findings of this chapter: from the growing exposure to climate hazards to shortages of food and natural resources to fatalities, the effects of climate change are vast yet variable. Cities must then plan accordingly. Because cities concentrate people, activities and infrastructure geographically, they are particularly vulnerable to the direct effect of climate change events, both rapid onset shocks and slower onset stressors. Okay, so people may know that cities make them more vulnerable in this sense because they would be, let's say, living in housing that's not pakka, that's not very vulnerable to heavy rain or wind and sea level rise and so on. But they will move there because the economic incentives can be so high that they will ignore these risks from climate change impacts. Rural and urban areas are linked economically, socially and environmentally. Moreover, the effects of climate events occurring outside of cities can spill over to them. We talked about the displacements of rural population to cities during climate disasters. Spillovers could occur by way of migration of people, affecting the pace and level of urbanization and urban form, and of economic sectors within cities, and by way of movement of goods and services via trade. Climate events affect groups of people differently, and those who are already more vulnerable have less ability to cope with or mitigate the effects. Okay, so keeping those in mind, let's read some more boxes. How do climate shocks and stressors differ? The breeze a little too strong, maybe let me close the window. This is my climate adaptation. As I said, I turned on the light for better lighting on my face, and I turned off the fan because it was creating a stroboscopic effect, and now I have to close the window, so now it's going to get warm in a minute here. A climate shock is an unpredictable weather event that damages the sustainability of a community. Examples are heat waves, floods, cyclones and wildfires. Climate stressors, or slow onset events, unfold gradually over time. These are often also referred to as chronic changes and acute changes. Examples are higher sea levels, climbing temperatures, ocean acidification, glacial retreat and related impacts, salinization, land and forest degradation, biodiversity loss and desertification. Some meaningful relationships exist between the rapid onset and slow onset events. Drought, for example, is an extreme weather event but is also closely linked to slow onset. Now we have the terminology flash droughts, and I have a podcast on that if you want to follow up. Incremental climate change is what causes these stressors. Interactions among rapid onset and slow onset events may result in crossing of thresholds. For example, a study in Florida finds that once the sea reached a critical level, the transition from a landscape characterized by upland forests and freshwater wetlands to one dominated by mangroves occurred suddenly following a single storm surge event. So you have slow changes happening and a shock puts it over the threshold and you don't come back. Changes in climate parameters, for example, temperature, precipitation, and their associated impacts such as water availability and crop productivity changes occur over long periods. Other boxes: does climate change lead to violence and migration? This has been a persistent thread. Climate conflicts, as they are often referred to. There is some evidence that just warm temperatures increase violence, especially domestic violence and so on. An emerging literature over the last few years has attempted to explore the relationship among climate change, conflict, and migration. The nexus of these three forces has long been anecdotally invoked as a stylized fact seeking to explain, for example, phenomena such as the Arab Spring, the revolution that started in Middle East that eventually led to the Syrian war and so on, and subsequent waves of both conflict and migration. Yet the scholarship has yielded divergent findings. Contrary to common belief, the evidence linking climate risks to conflict and forced displacement, especially in regions such as the Middle East and North Africa, is not unequivocal. So anthropologists tend to say it takes multiple perturbations for civilizations to go extinct or people to get up and move, and there are also arguments that civilizations don't really go extinct, that they migrate and blend in with other civilizations. This is for, going back in time as well. Measuring environmental risk in cities. Many of the climate hazard and disaster data that have informed understanding of the spatial variation of environmental risk cannot be used to study relative exposure within cities. So different neighborhoods and exposure being different. Event data are mostly cataloged for large areas, cities and regions, so measuring relative exposure within cities requires smaller scale data that reflect within city variation. For this reason, this paper by Rossetti focuses on flood and heat, for which high resolution grid data are available to study exposure within cities. So you can use satellite data and other kinds of data on floods and heat within the city to see how these disparate exposures happen. Summary and conclusions of this chapter on where we are and the chapter 3. The effects of a changing climate or what we understand, the effects of a climate change on cities are heterogeneous across places, sectors, and people. Because cities concentrate people, activities, and infrastructure, they can experience intense direct effects of climate shocks and stressors. These direct effects include rapid onset events such as extreme heat and cold, floods and wildfires, and slow onset events such as drought, air pollution, and land degradation. But these impacts do not occur in isolation. They interact and compound, making the effects more uncertain and potentially more disastrous. Yet, investments in durable construction, representing capital that would be very difficult to reallocate, continue in locations that may become unlivable over time. So it's the baggage, the historic ways of doing things can continue. The patterns of displacements in response to sudden shocks illustrate the gender differentiated characteristics, suggesting that the existence of many poorly understood facets of response that require attention. So if you have a sudden shock and quick action is needed, that immediately separates genders in terms of how they respond. Okay, so obviously men can run away quickly, and women tend to worry about children, belongings, safety, education, health, and so on and so forth. Okay, we'll come back and look at chapter 4, impact of cities on climate and the environment. So chapter 3 was on the impact of climate change and environmental change on the cities. Now we will look at how cities are impacting the climate and environment. Good information. Even though I'm being brief, the reports are easily available that you can read and follow up the details, because they also provide an extensive list of references that are very useful, and there are lots of data and notes. Each chapter has a long set of notes for each point that are being made. I'm not reading those in detail at all. I'm just adding this as one of the series of podcasts to the overall adaptation course. In a classroom, I wouldn't include so many things in one course, but this is on YouTube, and it's a series of podcasts arranged in certain sections and chapters, so people can pick and choose and learn what they want without considering it as one big course. Okay, so I hope it helps.